You think your apartment lease is bad? Try living in a culture where home renovation meant burning the house down with grandma still inside. Welcome to ancient history's worst Airbnb experiences. The Jia, cannibal songs of China's first ghosts. Before China had dynasties, it had ghost flutes and burned bones. The Jihu weren't an empire. They didn't build walls. They built tombs, ritual pits, and maybe, just maybe, a horror soundtrack to go with them. Jihu was a Neolithic settlement in Henan province, older than the pyramids and Stonehenge combined. About 9,000 years ago, this community of hunter-farmers was already fermenting wine, playing music, and, apparently, messing with corpses in ways that would make a forensic tech quit. Start with the graves. Archaeologists dug up over 300 of them. You'd expect skeletons, sure, but Jihu went full-body horror. Some graves had just skulls, no bodies. Others had extra limbs. A few had burned bones, mixed with ash and pottery shards. One even had a skull jammed into a smashed cooking pot. Not buried, cooked. Let's talk bones. Pig bones? Chicken bones? Nope. Human femurs, cracked open and dumped with tools and grain. At least 16 graves show clear signs of defleshing, as in, someone scraped the meat off and tossed the bones around like leftovers. Some scientists think they were cannibals. Others say it was ritual dismemberment. Either way, someone's uncle got turned into soup. Then there were the flutes. You've probably heard of the Jihu bone flutes. Those eerie wind instruments carved from crane wings. They play a 7-note scale. They also happen to be buried with the dead, sometimes shoved into rib cages or placed right next to broken skulls. The theory? These weren't just instruments. They were summoning tools, songs for spirits, or signals for the next sacrifice. And these flutes weren't tossed in at random. Some graves had multiple. In one, a man was buried with 2 flutes, his head bashed in, ribs missing, and legs bound. Either he was a rock star priest, or a human offering that hit all the high notes before the final scream. It gets worse. In one pit, archaeologists found a cluster of children's bones, stacked like firewood, all missing skulls. There was no sign of disease, no sign of burial care, just a scorch mark and a pile of tiny femurs. DNA testing showed they weren't related. That's not a family tomb. That's a child sacrifice pile. The Jihu also had ash circles around some burial sites, controlled burns, but these weren't cooking fires. The heat wasn't high enough to roast meat. What it did do was char the bones, blacken the pottery, and leave a layer of scorched earth. This wasn't lunch. This was a ritualized burning zone, maybe to release spirits, maybe to warn others. And then there's the wine. The Jihu made the oldest known fermented rice honey wine, found in jars sealed with resin. Delicious. But what happens when you're drinking wine in a graveyard, while flutes cry and a child's skull boils over a low fire? That's not a theory. That's a Wednesday in Jihu. There's even evidence of surgical experimentation. In one adult skull, researchers found a perfectly round hole, too clean to be a wound, too precise for an accident. Trepanation? Maybe. Did the guy survive? Not likely. His skull was found tossed in a pit with burned turtle shells and cracked femurs. Good luck explaining that to the ancestors. Speaking of turtles, Jihu people carved symbols into turtle shells, then burned them. The cracks were read like messages from the gods, but some of these divination shells were buried with charred human remains, suggesting the future wasn't being told, it was being bought. You want good harvests? Burn a child, crush a turtle, and play the flute until the gods blink. The creepiest part? They vanished. Around 5700 BCE, the entire settlement goes silent. Just gone. The flutes stop playing. The wine jars stop fermenting. And the ritual pits stay buried until the 20th century when construction workers stumbled on the nightmare beneath the fields. The Cucuteni-Trypillia, death by fire and clay. Before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before your ancestors were even whispering about gods, the Cucuteni-Trypillia people were torching their own cities and smiling while they did it. This was a Neolithic culture that stretched across modern-day Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. They built houses, shrines, and mega-settlements. Some had populations over 10,000. They made pottery so fancy it wouldn't look out of place at a hipster brunch spot. But their favorite hobby? Burning everything to the ground every 60 to 80 years. This wasn't arson. This was a ritual, a plan, a lifestyle. We know this because archaeologists found layers and layers of ash under nearly every site. Ash from entire villages that had been deliberately set on fire. And this didn't happen once. It happened dozens of times, at different settlements across centuries. Houses were packed with goods, tools, idols, sometimes even animal bones and human remains, then set ablaze, room by room, like some prehistoric fire festival. The burning wasn't for war. There's no evidence of invaders, no signs of mass violence. The houses weren't raided, they were prepared. In some cases, Doorways were blocked with clay, like a kiln. Then came the flames. What kind of culture torches its own towns and then builds new ones right on top of the ashes? Let's back up. The Trypillians built massive settlements. One called Talyanki had 3,000 buildings, arranged in concentric circles, covering 320 acres. That's bigger than ancient Troy. Inside these homes, people painted swirling red and black patterns, sun symbols, spirals, snakes, and eyes. Some rooms had clay altars. Others had female figurines with missing limbs or no faces, arranged in ritual corners like ceramic hostages. And the figurines, thousands of them. Some with exaggerated hips and bellies, others with slashed throats or hollowed torsos. These weren't dolls, they were offerings. In some burned homes, entire collections of figurines were found half-melted, fused to charred pottery. That's not a kitchen accident. That's symbolic execution. One theory, they believed houses had souls. After a few generations, those souls needed to be released by fire. So instead of renovating your grandma's place, you burned it to cleanse the spirit. Lovely tradition. Here's where it gets nasty. In several sites, human remains were found inside the burned structures. Not dozens, just a few, always alone, often children, usually near altars or ovens. Their bones showed signs of exposure to extreme heat and sometimes disarticulation, meaning limbs were cut or pulled apart before the burning. Accident? Burial? Nope. The rest of the population got carefully dug graves in cemeteries. These in-house bodies? They got roasted. Some researchers think these were human sacrifices, ritual victims offered up to bless the next round of building. You torch the house screams, the gods listen, then you rebuild. It doesn't stop there. Excavations uncovered massive pits filled with animal bones, broken pots, and occasionally human jaws. Just jaws, sometimes arranged in lines or circles. Archaeologists think these were ceremonial disposal zones, places where the remains of rituals were dumped. You don't lose track of 20 lower mandibles by accident. Even the kilns, the big ovens used to fire pottery, were weird. Some had signs of blood residue, others had bone ash mixed into the clay. Whether it was human or animal is still debated, but let's just say you wouldn't want to eat cereal out of a Trypillian bowl without asking what went in it first. Now, what about the giant site burnings? At the massive settlement of Nebelivka, scientists found entire districts burned to charcoal, with multiple houses ignited simultaneously. This wasn't, a fire spread. This was coordinated. It likely took hundreds of people working together to torch an entire neighborhood. Why? Renewal, cleansing. The symbolic death of a settlement to give birth to the next. Some believe the community even held fire festivals with drumming, dancing, idol burning, and maybe a sacrifice or two before walking a few feet away and starting over. Then around 3000 BCE, they stopped, abruptly. The last known Trypillian sites show panic abandonment, half-finished pottery, scattered tools, broken walls. No more ritual burnings, no more mass settlements. The culture vanished. Some say climate change, others blame invaders, but there's no solid answer. All we know is, they were there, they kept burning themselves down, and then they were gone. Trypillian urban renewal. Burn it all. Start again, and maybe throw in a person for luck. The Elamites, punishment by poison, fire, and gods. If you were an enemy of the Elamites, death wasn't your problem. Dying slowly was. This ancient Iranian civilization ran their cities like temples, their palaces like fortresses, and their legal system like a divine grudge match. The Elamites showed up around 2700 BCE in what's now southwestern Iran. They lasted nearly 2,000 years and built a terrifying reputation for cruelty cloaked in ceremony. The capital, Susa, was a sacred and bureaucratic nightmare. You could be executed for blasphemy, tax fraud, or just annoying the wrong priest king. Start with their fire altars. These weren't candle-lit prayer circles, they were execution pits. During droughts or military defeats, the Elamites sacrificed prisoners to their gods by burning them alive in open-air sanctuaries. The flames weren't just religious symbols, they were justice. Elamite texts describe feeding the fire with flesh to restore divine favor. That wasn't a metaphor. In one Elamite temple ruin, archaeologists found a pit full of charred human remains mixed with broken incense burners and weapon fragments. Some skeletons had their hands bound. Others had fractured skulls from blunt force trauma before the burning started. Murder first, roast second. Then came the poison gas. No, not modern chemical warfare. But these guys figured out that burning bitumen and sulfur inside enemy tunnels created toxic smoke. During a 2nd millennium BCE siege at Dur-Untash, Elamite engineers collapsed ventilation shafts and lit pitch fires inside underground corridors. The invaders suffocated on black, oily smoke while trying to dig in. It's considered one of the earliest uses of gas-based warfare in history, Smells like victory. Punishment for citizens wasn't any prettier. Women accused of adultery were stoned to death, but not in public squares. The Elamites preferred burial executions. The accused was thrown into a pit, partially buried in clay, then stoned from above. You die in mud and shame, crushed slowly under the weight of moral superiority and gravel. Temple violations? Worse. If you touched sacred objects without permission, priests would order tongue removal followed by blinding. Then you'd be dressed in ceremonial robes and paraded through the streets as a divine example of, "Don't touch the gold, Karen." They also punished priests. If you gave a false omen or botched a ritual, you didn't just lose your job, you got flayed. According to clay tablets recovered at Chogazan Bill, the skin of disgraced priests was sometimes nailed to temple doors. Divine feedback, Elamite style. Political enemies faced ritual dismemberment. High-ranking traitors or rival nobles were captured and cut into 6 pieces, each sent to a different city as a warning. Some were stuffed with bitumen and placed in public squares like meat scarecrows. One Elamite general reportedly walked past his own leg in one such display just before being killed. Dark, efficient, memorable. The Elamites were also obsessed with building security. City walls weren't just defenses, they were tombs. In major cities like Susa, researchers discovered human skeletons buried inside the wall foundations. Not criminals, chosen victims, sometimes children, sometimes adults, always buried alive. The theory? These sacrifices turned the walls into spiritual barriers. Ghost-reinforced architecture. Here's a particularly cursed detail. Elamite rulers had statues of themselves placed in temples. Normal, right? But these statues had removable heads. Why? Because the head was used in beheading rituals. You messed up? The king would ceremonially behead his own statue, then order your real head removed. Your skull might end up in a temple brazier or painted black and placed at a crossroads. Let's not skip over corpse management. Unlike the Mesopotamians, who honored their dead with proper burials, Elamites liked to abandon the disgraced. Bodies of executed prisoners or heretics were dumped into curse pits, shallow ditches outside the city walls, where the sun baked your soul and the jackals handled the rest. These pits were covered in symbols warning that anyone who buried the dead would join them. Grave kindness? Forbidden. And still, they had a bureaucracy. Elamite scribes recorded crimes and punishments in exquisite cuneiform, down to the last decapitated cousin. They filed clay tablets like DMV clerks of doom. Your fine for stealing a goat? 1 goat and 1 ear. Your punishment for lying about an omen? 3 lashes, exile, and public humiliation via poop throwing. Yes, it's in the texts. Eventually, the Elamites fell to the Achaemenid Persians around 539 BCE. Cyrus the Great swept through and torched their capital. But even after death, the Elamites weren't done. Their temples were so feared that invading armies refused to loot them. Superstition? Probably. Or maybe they just didn't want to be the next skeleton baked into a mud brick. The Lulubi, mountain kingdom of the flayed. High in the Zagros Mountains, the Lulubi didn't build kingdoms. They carved them into the rock and smeared blood across the cliffs. You didn't pass through their territory, you survived it. The Lulubi were a tribal confederation tucked between what is now western Iran and northern Iraq. They didn't leave behind palaces or literature. What they did leave was a giant stone billboard of a king standing on the necks of his enemies. And if you squint at the detail, those enemies have no skin. Meet Anu Banini, the most famous Lulubi ruler. Around 2300 BCE, he carved a victory relief so brutal, it makes modern propaganda look like kindergarten art. Located on a cliff face in Saripoli Zahab, the Anu Banini relief shows him holding a bow, crushing a captive beneath his feet, while a goddess presents a line of bound, naked prisoners. Some have ropes through their noses, some are missing limbs, some are clearly skinned. This wasn't art, this was a threat display, a stone message to say, try anything, we'll peel you like fruit. And they weren't bluffing. The Lulubi were infamous even in Mesopotamian records. The Akkadians, the Gutians, and later the Assyrians all complained about them. These people didn't follow orders. They raided villages, ambushed caravans, and flayed soldiers for fun. And they always retreated into the mountains, so you couldn't catch them. They were ghosts with knives. Captured enemies were taken to cliff altars, where priests, or maybe just particularly excited warriors, performed ritual executions. Victims were often beheaded, then skinned. The hides were stretched on wooden frames and left to rot on mountain passes. Their skulls? Piled into cairns. Want to trade through Lulubi land? Good luck walking past a stack of 40 rotting faces grinning at your donkeys. Their version of diplomacy was just as friendly. One recovered Akkadian tablet describes how Lulubi emissaries entered a city with gifts, then poisoned the governor's water and disappeared into the hills. Another mentions a temple priest flayed alive for refusing tribute. His skin was nailed to the temple gate. That wasn't symbolic. That was a receipt. The Lulubi weren't just raiders. They were ritual killers. Excavations at mountain caves in the Zagros have uncovered bone piles arranged in geometric patterns, especially skulls. Some had holes drilled into them, possibly for stringing into garlands. Others were blackened from fire, suggesting either cremation or slow roasting. Neither's a great exit strategy. Then there are the sacrificial towers. At a site called Gerdai Dasht, archaeologists found the foundations of a circular stone platform surrounded by burned soil, charred bones, and broken weapons. The bones weren't just human. They were arranged in clusters, with some showing blade marks, spinal trauma, and heat exposure. Several had been split down the middle, vertically. The leading theory? Execution platform. Enemies or criminals were taken up, killed in full view, and left there to rot or to be picked at by eagles. Air burial meets public deterrent. They also had death chants. One cuneiform tablet from a Sumerian temple mentions the mountain songs of Lulubum, eerie howls said to be performed by Lulubi raiders before ambushes. No one knows what the lyrics were. But when your neighbors describe your musical genre as psychological warfare, you're probably not making love ballads. If you think they treated their own people better, don't. Elite warriors who lost battles were ritually executed, sometimes strangled with bowstrings, sometimes forced to walk naked into enemy territory as offerings. There's a record of one general skinning himself, or being made to, as penance for retreat. His skin was then burned in a fire pit which was sprinkled with blood and barley, because apparently shame isn't complete without snacks. What's terrifying is how long they lasted. The Lulubi weren't wiped out in one big war. They just faded, slowly, into history. One century, they're raiding cities. The next, they're mercenaries. The next, gone. No empire absorbed them. They were never conquered outright. They just became ghosts. The Xiongnu, the Empire of Skull Drums. If you were a Han Chinese general marching north and you heard drums echoing across the steppes, bad news. You were probably hearing your buddy's skull getting pounded like a war gong. Welcome to the Xiongnu Empire. These weren't wandering nomads with itchy horses. They were a military machine that terrorized East Asia for over 400 years. Think Mongols, but earlier, rougher, and somehow even more into bone accessories. They controlled the Eurasian steppe from modern-day Mongolia down into northern China. Their war bands were fast, brutal, and by many Chinese accounts, unbelievably savage. We're talking about a culture that treated captured enemies like livestock and worshipped at shrines made from actual human heads. Let's start with their favorite sound, the skull drum, real thing. After major victories, Xiongnu warriors would take the heads of enemy soldiers, boil off the flesh, stretch rawhide over the top, and use them as percussion in war rituals. According to Han records, the drums were used to inspire fear, summon spirits, and, presumably, make sure the dead knew exactly what happened to them. Their chiefs didn't just beat the drums, they drank to them. Literally. Skulls were also carved into chalices, used for oath-taking ceremonies where warlords would promise loyalty, then sip wine or blood from a slain enemy's head. No goblets, just boneware. Punishment for treason? Throat-slitting followed by exposure to the elements. The Xiongnu didn't bury traitors. They left them to rot in the open plains, as food for wolves and crows. And if you were high-ranking, congratulations. You got strangled with a bowstring, a noble death, supposedly painless, but very public. And don't get caught spying. Chinese emissaries who overstayed their welcome were sometimes flayed, then smoked, literally hung over low fires until their skin dried like jerky. That wasn't punishment. That was a message. But even loyal warriors weren't safe. When a Xiongnu ruler died, so did a bunch of other people. Tomb excavations show that high-status graves were packed with strangled wives, young servants, horses, and sometimes children. One tomb in Mongolia had over 40 bodies crammed in, all ritualistically posed, all sacrificed at once. They weren't buried. They were arranged like a still life of loyal death. Then there's what they did to enemies in battle. The Xiongnu were experts at psychological warfare. They'd charge in, kill just enough soldiers to make a point, and then take prisoners alive, only to mutilate them and release them back home. One Han account describes a returning patrol missing tongues, ears, and creepily eyelids. That wasn't a fight, that was performance art. Want to know how they treated kids? Here's one. When Han border towns were raided, young boys were sometimes kidnapped, raised in Xiongnu camps, and trained as fighters. The ones who resisted? Left to freeze naked in the snow as a test of spirit. Survivors were adopted, the rest? Forgotten in the frost. If a village resisted too hard, Xiongnu warriors would behead the elders, impale the leaders, and take the women as trophies. Survivors were marched hundreds of miles back to camps. Those who collapsed were left behind. Those who made it were used as human shields in future raids. That's right, hostages strapped to the front of siege carts. But they weren't always on the attack. When Han China built the Great Wall to stop them, the Xiongnu responded by digging underneath it. Not kidding, they tunneled, they bribed guards, they built ghost armies, fake encampments full of dummies and empty fires, to lure enemy scouts into ambushes. One battle report describes a valley filled with decoy tents and skulls on poles, set up to look like an army was resting. When the Han troops attacked, the Xiongnu circled behind and slaughtered them from both sides. The bones from that ambush? Dug up in the 20th century, still arranged in rows. The Xiongnu worshipped a sky god named Tengri, and they believed warfare pleased him. Some scholars think the skull drums and blood oaths were part of these sacral rituals, turning war into a form of divine communion. So when you were being sacrificed, it wasn't just for politics, it was for heaven. Their decline came slowly. Infighting, rival clans, and pressure from the Han eventually shattered the confederation. Some Xiongnu split off and became allies of Rome. Others faded into the steppes, but the terror stuck around. Han officials kept writing about them even after they were gone. That tells you everything. No one forgets an empire that plays music on human heads. The next time you hear distant drumming in a war movie, ask yourself, is it just percussion, or is it history beating on bone?